Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Flint. If you're new to us, let me tell you about us. This is a place where community exists, where the differences are welcomed, where there is discussion, not arguments, and where you're encouraged to find your own path, not follow a leader's. Now, we are welcoming to everybody, but welcoming congregation has special meaning to us because it means that we are a safe place for those of the LGBTQ community. This is a place where they can be their authentic self. And if you'd like more information about UUism or this church, please contact our ministers or our office. The information can be found at the uuflint.org. And today's speaker is Melissa Jetters. She is a commissioned lay minister of the First Unitarian Church of Toledo. She is a deep thinker and a passionate person. Currently, she's in seminary to become a minister and is also working as a librarian. She was born in the Ohio River Valley in southeast Ohio. And when the steel mills closed there, her father took her and the rest of the family to Michigan, where he worked in a professional job in the steel industry. Though she lived a comfortable life as a child, as a young independent adult trying to find her own way, Melissa embraced learning firsthand about poverty. She has worked with women's shelters for battered women and women addicted to drugs. She has worked in civil rights and community development organization, listening to people tell her stories about discrimination, subprime lending, desperation, abuse, and illness. She has walked these neighborhoods and listened and learned. There's a lot that can be learned by listening to the needs that people have. She is a community organizer, an adjunct faculty at the colleges teaching sociology, a researcher, and a published author. And we're lucky to have her. Maya Angelou tells us, "I have found among its other benefits that giving liberates the soul." Giving of your time and talents and treasure is what can liberate your soul. Consider giving online at uuflint.org or by sending a check to the church office. And we thank you for all the gifts that you have given. Now for some announcements. Kindred Conversations will be on February 3rd, and the topic is America and Guns. Again, it's February 3rd. And at that time, our ministers, Jerry and Lynn, will be doing a monthly informal conversation focusing on dealing with life, UU style. This time, we're talking about guns. And we're going to talk about what are our experiences with guns. Did you have armed ancestors? Did you grow up with guns? When did America with guns become big problems for our nation and political issues for progressives? What principles guide your thoughts towards these? Would you have an ideal gun law look like? If you'd like to join into this, please look at our website. There will be information about how to join our Zoom conversation, which again will be at 6 to 7 p.m. on February 3rd. And please join us for coffee hour after the service at the Zoom. ID can be found at the end of this service. It can also be found on our website. Now for our prologue.
If we don't find a way to transform our pain, we will always transmit it to those around us or turn it against ourselves. If your religion is not teaching you how to recognize, hold, and transform suffering, it is junk religion. Friar Richard Rohr. At this time, I invite you to get out your chalice and light it. For our chalice lighting today, I have these words. We light our chalice today to awaken the calling within us, to devote our being to a community where all are welcomed. Let this flame represent the burning desire to build a life-sustaining community, a community where love prevails from the work we have done to make it so.
If you'll join with me now in reciting our covenant, recognizing the richness of diversity, the beauty and wonder of shared worship, and the transforming power of love and service, we gather as a sacred, intentional community to freely seek knowledge and truth and to celebrate the fullness of life, and by our actions to increase goodness and justice.
I have these opening words this morning. Grace desired. I wrote these. In this anxious time of waiting, let us reflect on our capacity to feel with those who suffer. Let us imagine hands reaching out into empty space. Where is our beloved community? Where are those who will always take us in? Where are those who help us heal? Spirit of life and love, allow our egos to sink in exchange for a rising understanding of grace. Break us open to the grace of unconditional love. Show us the ways we can connect. Allow our compassion to flow like water. I invite you into a moment of contemplation, meditation, and prayer. This prayer also is by Erica A. Hewitt. You, mercy without end, are the sea of tenderness that holds us all, grieving alongside us in our moments of hurt. Hold me, gentle me, keep me afloat. When I see pain outside of myself, make me brave enough to move towards it, that I might lighten another person's burden. Because the only way through this is together. The reading today is by Erica A. Hewitt, as was the quote that I spoke about earlier. It is called, "What Do We Do with Our Pain?" On a New York City subway, passengers sit. In the foreground, a man cradles his face in one hand. People are in pain all around us, all the time. How can we be companions to those in pain and bear witness so that pain can be transformed into something less harmful? Last week, the crowd on a New York City subway herded me into a corner against someone's seat. A man in his 20s with red eyes, his face etched with grief. When I'm around people in pain, sometimes the energy of their sadness rolls over me like an invisible ocean wave. If I remain passive, its force can knock me down. So as the subway rumbled us uptown, I tightened my grip on the bar overhead, closed my eyes, and held the stranger in loving kindness. As I breathed in, I imagined absorbing the thick, oily smoke of his pain. I visualized the great, glorious tenderness as a cloud of light above us at ground level. Each time I breathed out, I imagined myself a conduit, drawing that love down toward us and pulling it around the stranger. The subway screeched to a halt at my stop, and as my eyes flew open, they landed on the stranger, who was using his sweater to wipe tears off his cheek. Our eyes met. Before I could look away, he offered a half smile. I smiled back. Buddhists will recognize what I did as a practice called Tonglen, but if you were to call it prayer, I wouldn't argue with you. One of my friends often wonders out loud whether it's ethical to pray for someone without their consent. But I've weathered rough patches where I felt myself flailing, sinking, in need of all of the ways, from concrete assistance to the mystical transmission of love that might hold me up. You want me to share your hope with me? I'll take it. Pain is going to visit all of us. You, me, the guy on the subway. Sporadically, but unrelentingly. As long as life lasts. Ultimately, I believe there's one thing as common and as powerful as pain. Our capacity to be companions to one another. Both our genetic material and our holy spark compel us to reach for one another as partners in hope and fellow meaning makers to help one another transform pain into something holdable. Thank you for inviting me to your congregation this morning. We are staying away and staying connected. And my sermon this morning is called Pandemics, Mystics, and Change. The new year is a time of reflection and thinking and hoping for well-being. It is a time where we look at the past in consideration of our intentions. Let's face it, this past year has been challenging, to say the least. It might feel great to let it go. However, the pandemic of 2020 refrains to abide by the Gregorian calendar. It is still with us. There is hope on the horizon. There is an impetus towards a future resolution. As more people are getting vaccinated, we can see a time when we will worship together in person. Until then, it is important to do all you can do to reduce the risk of contagion to yourself and the people with whom you are connected. With this hope for future resolution in mind, let's consider the 2020 pandemic. What caused it? And what have we learned? This week, I spent some time talking with a few of you from this congregation, and I asked 2 questions reflecting on lessons from the pandemic. What caused it, and what did you learn? Now, the number of folks who participated in this focus group do not constitute a representative sample of the congregation. And what that means is that the answers they give lack any capacity to be generalizable to all Unitarian Universalists in the Flint congregation. So it would be inaccurate to use these responses to say that this is what all Unitarian Universalists or all Unitarian Universalists in this congregation think about the pandemic. For causes, some of you responded with the cause and origin being Wuhan, China, and that the virus came from a bat. There was deeper reflection that pandemics have always been with us since we domesticated animals. And that this information comes from the book by Gerald Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And since we have domesticated animals, we as humanity, any place there is interaction between humans and animals, that there has been pandemics. Some people said that the pandemic, the cause of the pandemic was human ignorance, that a virus caused it, but human ignorance makes it a pandemic. That there's lack of infrastructure to deal with a disease. The dogged self-importance and need to have this rugged individualism helps to perpetuate it. Another answer was the virus, for the cause of the virus was China in an animal lab. Another answer was that the cause was from an animal, and also, I just don't know. For lessons, in this group of folks who talked and spoke with me the other night, one of the things that someone said was that there were no rights that were absolute rights, and when your rights infringe upon others, then there are limits to your rights. there was discussion about how much we need people. There was a lesson learned about reflection and learning patience and Zoom and using Zoom and how we are in this community meaning in Flint, more wedded to this community than before. There was also a responses in terms of lessons that more patience was needed, that people have a lot of anxiety, but also recognition that they can survive being a person of privilege, even though the technology is challenging, and that it's even more challenging for young people to learn. One of the lessons was community and connection, that they were having deeper conversations with people and had gotten to know people better. Now, this conversation that I had was not a scientific study by any means. However, Pew Research in October of 2020 did conduct a study, a survey of Americans thinking about the pandemic. And I want to share their results, which can be used to characterize American public opinion. The Pew Research Center for Religion and Public Life published the results of a survey entitled, "What Lessons Do Americans See for Humanity in the Pandemic?" According to the survey, about 86% of Americans said that there were lessons to be learned from the pandemic. 35% believe the lesson is from God, while 37% say the lesson was not from God. 13% say they do not believe in God. 13% said that there was no lesson, and 1% did not answer. The study found that people learned lessons from God, about society, their priorities, government, and politics, as well as practical lessons. Lessons people said they learned that were from God included the preciousness of life, being humble, and taking time at home to pray and know God. Lessons people learned about society included the failure to face racism, economic inequality, climate change, capitalism as an inhumane and unsustainable system, and how public health affects the economy. People learn to take this time to rethink their priorities by questioning the importance of relationships, their materialism, empathy, and taking time for well-being. People learned that those who died had underlying health issues. The lessons people expressed about government and politics were global. People discussed the political partisanship in the United States, the administration of China and nations across the globe. People urgently expressed that science be prioritized over bipartisan politics. Practical lessons people learned included cleanliness, wearing masks, washing hands, better anticipation of crises, and listening to the experts. So what though? What have we learned to recognize, hold, and transform our pain from this pandemic? Or our fears? Lessons imply that we know something. Even more, lessons imply that we are informed with next steps, what we need to do. Has knowing the cause of the pandemic helped you transform your suffering? Humanity has been through pandemics before. In 1918, there were lessons about staying away from each other, wearing masks, and issues with nations communicating clearly with each other. Even then, nations had a hard time being open to one another about a virus that was going to show up on their shores. On our collective blue boat home. Calling the 1918 influenza pandemic the Spanish flu is indicative of the refusal to communicate what was happening, to be open. Maybe humanity was too busy fighting each other. There was, after all, a war going on. The influenza spread through England, Italy, France, and Spain. Spain, however, was neutral in the war, and therefore newspapers in Spain were free to report what was happening. So call it the Spanish flu, because they reported it. But for the fear of blowing it out of proportion, people in Europe were silent about the 1918 pandemic. 50 million people worldwide died. That's a small number in comparison to the over 400 million people and counting who have died just in the United States from the coronavirus. We, and I mean humanity, have missed the mark on this. Even though public health experts had the information about COVID-19, government officials said they did not want to make a big deal of it, so there was no national plan to deal with it. So we turned away from each other, stayed in our place due to what? Defined roles? Sovereign territories? Or a perception that power is a game of win or lose? Is morality a game? 400,000 people, some of whom you know, some who will die alone, suffering of skin deprivation, because this virus is too contagious to have their loved ones with them to hold their hand as they die. Still, there was also another, even earlier pandemic in the 14th century. Humanity was suffering with a variant of the bubonic plague. The Christian crusades in Western Europe had decimated part of the population, while the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe killed many Eastern Orthodox Christians. The European economy was in decline. Food was in low supply, and consequently, people had a lower resistance to this variant of the bubonic plague. When they looked to the cause of the plague, they felt compelled to blame themselves, collective sin, or scapegoat. Whose fault is it? And while we're on the mission of fault finding, what degree of maturity do we have to recognize our role in the process? But does fault finding help us recognize and hold suffering? Does causality help us transform the pain? There is a point to knowing the cause because we found a vaccine. We, meaning humanity. And for this, we are so grateful. However, having a vaccine and having leadership to equitably distribute it are two different things. It also will not return to us our loved ones or ease our grief for them. We are still suffering. We may not be at our best, especially when we're so anxious. We have a tendency to blame people for how we feel or distance ourselves from who or what we believe is at fault. Much of this suffering is rooted in how we first learned to feel and manage our emotions. This is still true. So much more true during this pandemic. If your religion does not help you recognize, hold, and transform your suffering, maybe it is time to discard it. I think the religious mystics teach us how to identify, hold, and change our pain. How do we manage our emotions? In the 14th century, there was Julian of Norwich, an empathetic Christian or Christian mystic. There's a whole group of Unitarian Universalist mystics who ground themselves in science. Mystics teach us how to change our pain and suffering, how to hold it, how to recognize it, how to identify it. Julian of Norwich was not a person of low wealth, yet she was open to feel with people who were suffering at that time. People were hungry. There was the Crusades. Lots of people had died. There were people who were living in the Ottoman Empire, and they had people who had died. Julian wrote a manuscript, The Divine Revelations of Love, to teach people by sharing her visions of God, of Jesus, Mary, or, as I say, her introspective experiences. In her writing, she assured people that God was not angry, and love was his meaning. All will be well, and all will be well. We could learn to be introspective, embrace humility, and open ourselves to seeing the suffering of the world. If we could ground this process in the science of our time, if we could be curious and open to engage creativity and support each other, maybe we can shift this chaos. Perhaps we could transform our suffering, our need to blame and distance ourselves, and transform our pain. How can you put away your fears to see the whole larger system and your part in it? What could you do to be less anxious while recognizing, holding, and transforming pain? In Unitarian Universalism, none of us gets to abdicate the responsibility to one leader. We don't get a pass on the suffering in the world. Our faith ancestor, James Luther Adams, said that we are all called. It is the prophethood of all believers. We are all called to side with the poor and the oppressed. Empathy is a scientific fact. What one of us has never encountered cruelty, pain, or suffering? If you can feel it, you must deal with it. I am confident that we are all called to this kind of mysticism. But you can read about it if that prepares you to change. There are writers like Margaret J. Wheatley or Rupert Sheldrake who talk about leading systemically and the science behind the spiritual practices like meditation and singing and even more. Going to church, listening to a speaker. There are also people who are leading the change. One person alone may have an idea, but in community, we are stronger together. We can choose to assist each other through this time. We can choose to associate with each other because it eases our suffering. Our ability to connect with each other could be grace. Let us go forward to transform our pain and suffering. Let us be the change and never again take one step back. Amen. Ashe. Blessed be. And for our closing words, grace received. In this anxious time of waiting, we feel with those who suffer. We answer the hand reaching out to us in new ways. We are beloved community. We are becoming the people who will always embrace the many. We are becoming the people who help each other all heal. For we know love is a circle with no bounds. All are embraced by this grace. I invite you now to extinguish your flame. And I have these words. Now that we are awakened to our calling, let our actions be devotions that welcome all with love into this community. As this flame is extinguished, it is sent with you to keep your divine spark alive. It is our task, yours and mine, to kindle the flame in each other, to sustain a growing community where love prevails.